By strolling the rolling hills of the Shenandoah Valley, it's hard to imagine it being the front lines of multiple battles during the Civil War. Today, we'll learn about the evolution of the region as we explore Cedar Creek and Belle Grove National Historical Park. I'm your host, Missy Renz, and this is the Parks Podcast. I'd like to welcome Adam Prado, who is the park ranger at Cedar Creek and Belle Grove National Historical Park. Adam, welcome to the Parks Podcast.
Thank you, Missy.
So we start with some park stats. Let me go through these. Cedar Creek and Belle Grove National Historical Park is located in Middletown, Virginia. It was created on December 19th, 2002, when George W. Bush was president of the United States. The park is 3,700 acres. And some fun facts: there is a driving tour that is 17.5 miles long and includes 9 stops. And the park is dedicated to preserving historic spaces, maintaining open spaces, and protecting natural resources in partnership with 5 other key organizations. So, Adam, let's start by maybe you could tell us a little bit about why it was so important in 2002, which doesn't feel like that long ago, to create this as a park.
Well, there never had been a national park battlefield in the Shenandoah Valley, even though the valley was an important theater of the Civil War. The Confederates used it to threaten Washington, D.C. and keep federal troops away from Richmond. And I'd say in the late 90s, there was probably a lot of development that threatened the battlefield, which was under preservation to different degrees by private organizations. But in 2002, it actually became a part of the national park system.
Does it happen very often where a park is created with this motto of preserving open space and historic spaces?
Yes, yes and no. The traditional model of a national park or even a national battlefield or historic site is usually the federal government owns some amount of property and does everything inside that. At our park, and in a lot of, I would say, newer historical parks that have been created over the last 25 years or so, are in a slightly different model where there'd be some kind of federal private partnership. So, for example, like our park, Cedar Creek and Belle Grove, the Park Service, the federal government only owns about 130 acres out of the 3,700 you mentioned. The rest is owned by those other organizations that are part of the law that established the park and private landowners.
And I want to mention those because they've been around for a long time and have done a lot of work long before 2002. And that's Belle Grove Inc., Cedar Creek Battlefield Foundation, National Trust for Historical Preservation, Shenandoah County, and the Shenandoah Valley Battlefields Foundation. And full disclosure, I grew up not far from this park. I didn't live there when it was made a park, but these other organizations, if you're from that area, they are known because Belle Grove and the surrounding area has been very active in preserving the space.
Correct. Yeah, all those organizations predate the National Park Service in the Shenandoah Valley.
So talking a little bit about the story of the park, one of the things that I love on the website, I love this phrase, and I'm hoping you can tell us a little bit about what it means. But the website talks about it's backcountry to breadbasket to battlefield and beyond.
Yeah, that's kind of our way of summing up kind of the full scope of human history and prehistory in the valley and within the boundaries of the park. People have been occupying the valley since 11,000 years ago, but it also saw some of the early colonization of Western Virginia, its development into an important agricultural region, which was one of the reasons the Shenandoah Valley campaigns in the Civil War were fought here, because it was such an important strategic area. And beyond is really just kind of our way of keeping open the interpretation of the history past the Civil War through a reconstruction and up until the present day.
And when I think about that backcountry and breadbasket in particular, what would this area have been like prior to battles?
In the early 1800s, it was agriculture or farms, some big plantations like Belle Grove, but mostly kind of smaller holdings. Would have looked a little different from the Virginia you might picture, like at Monticello and Thomas Jefferson and George Washington. It was really big estates. that grew tobacco. Here it was more of a grain, commercial grain farming. So wheat was a big crop here, growing crops for food for sale outside the valley. And along with that, there were a lot of mills and kind of small scale industry up and down the valley. The farms and the mills depending to some extent on enslaved labor, either who were owned by people who ran the farms, and in a lot of cases in the Shenandoah Valley, enslaved labor was rented out to people who needed them seasonally. So it was a slightly different kind of model of kind of agriculture, plantation agriculture than you might have found in other parts of the South.
Would life have been hard?
I just in general to our way of looking from modern times, yeah, life would have been hard. I mean, no electricity. You had to go outside in all kinds of weather for the bathroom. Farming was hard work in a time when there wasn't a lot of machinery in use for farming. So if whether you were an enslaved laborer working in the fields, or even if you're doing paid labor, you'd be working pretty hard just to raise food.
I look there as you're standing. I mean, it's beautiful. It is these rolling hills, and the fields sort of change colors. And I went 2 weeks ago, so this is November. It was very colorful in the fall. And I thought to myself, how in the world did they, you know, build these homes and plow these fields? And without Route 11, I don't know how people would get there. I think it would be treacherous to be in that part of Virginia.
Yeah, it was a little remote, even for in eastern state like Virginia. The Valley Turnpike is pretty old. It goes back to that's Route 11 today. It goes back to the 1830s when it was first like commissioned as a turnpike, and the idea was to improve the access between the farms in the valley and the markets on the coast. But there have been kind of trails kind of up and down this valley, since prehistory. Native Americans used it to kind of travel up and down the Appalachian Valley, and then later settlers kind of followed those routes into the valley.
So we talk about the backcountry and the breadbasket, and then there were the battlefields. And in 1864, we had some pretty major battles from the Civil War. Can you tell us a little bit about the Battle of Cedar Creek?
Yeah, there had been battles all throughout the war, especially in 1862. And then in 1864, as the end of the war was getting closer, towards the end of 1864, late in the summer and in the fall, the U.S. Army finally kind of showed up in force and aggressively tried to reap the Confederates out of the valley. The Confederates used the valley. It was a little inaccessible, so it was a good place to hide. It was also an important food source for the Confederate Army, and occasionally the Confederates would come down the valley and threaten Washington, D.C. So eventually Lincoln and his generals had enough. Philip Sheridan was the commanding general, and he came in with a large army, about 40,000 troops, with well-equipped cavalry, and they were well supplied. And they finally started beating the Confederates back up the valley. By up, I mean kind of south and uphill. So they won some important battles at Third Winchester and Fisher's Hill. And after that came the Battle of Cedar Creek, which was really the Confederates' last attempt to engage the Federals in the valley, and really the last kind of time they were an effective fighting force there.
I can't imagine what life must have been like during those days of these battles. And I was reading about the heater house, and this is a home. So when you're in the area, you see Belle Grove, and it is a kind of traditional plantation home. But then there's the heater house, which is being restored for preservation. And in one of the stories that I was reading, it talked about they would welcome soldiers for meals and whatnot. And it alluded to the fact that maybe on October 16th, 1864, they would have been home just living life while this battle was taking place. Is that the way it was during the Civil War? These battles would just take place in people's front yards?
Yes, they're probably being generous when they said they welcomed soldiers. Sometimes they didn't have clothes. Sometimes they just come in and take what they were hungry, take what they needed or wanted. Um, there are plenty of eyewitness accounts of the battle. We also know that a lot of people who lived in Middletown and lived in the valley left during the war. there are references to one man staying in the home of somebody in Middletown who had left. He said he was refugeeing up in the mountains somewhere. So we're not entirely clear about all the families who stayed in the area, but we do know some firsthand accounts of the battle. People who like literally saw shooting in their front yards.
And because this park is so new, is there still a lot well, it's new, but the relationships are quite old, but is there still a lot of research and digging to find stories?
Yes. So, the Civil War is pretty well documented, but, because, when, especially in the lands held by the federal government, we still do occasional archaeological work, and we have learned some new things. It's usually kind of more information about stuff we already knew about, like perhaps location of a certain camp, kind of confirming things that we knew about through documentation. And over at Belle Grove, they've done a lot of archaeological work on the enslaved quarters area. They've learned a lot about what some of the material in everyday life would have been like for the people enslaved at Belle Grove, but have also kind of uncovered a lot of questions that still need to be answered. So yeah, there's still lots of ongoing research here.
And I love that we're talking about Belle Grove, but I do want to tell listeners that this is a special 2 edition episode because we also have an in-depth conversation with the folks at Belle Grove to talk about things like that. So if you're listening and you want to know more, I encourage you to go to the next episode where you can learn a lot more of the specifics around Belle Grove. So the other thing I think in the visitor center, and you have Faces of the Valley, and this is also portrayed on the website. There's so many stories that you're telling. Actually, it's places and faces, and now I'm not going to remember the third category. But obviously, the players in Cedar Creek and Belle Grove are important because you put a lot of emphasis on that. Is there anyone in particular that you love the story or would want to share with this audience?
Yeah, it was important for us to, kind of show the fact that these, the battles and the history wasn't just kind of numbers and statistics, but, there are people involved. And so the exhibit you mentioned in the visitor center, The Faces of the Valley, kind of shows a pretty diverse group of people who lived in the valley, both Confederate and U.S. officers and soldiers, but also civilians, some white, some black, men and women, families, individuals. It was important for us to kind of show some of those people who kind of were witness to the events, the historical events of the valley. One story, in fact, she's not in the exhibit or on our website, but one story that we know was documented and it was from a woman who, as a little girl, was firsthand witness to the fighting in Middletown. Her name was Serena Spencer, and she has a descendant who's living in this area of Virginia today, who likes to share this story. But she was interviewed back in 1915 about her experience witnessing the battle, and she mentioned that as a little girl, she was about 10 years old, and she didn't really understand what was going on or really comprehend the dangers. So she, as the cannons or bombs, as she referred to them, were kind of flying around Middletown, she ran out into the street, was kind of running around watching the battle, thinking it was all pretty grand. And as an older woman, she looked back on it and thought that was kind of silly, but she thought it was pretty exciting. And her parents and the neighbors had to kind of go chase her around and get her back inside.
That would be
Yeah.
pretty sensational if you didn't realize the risk associated with being out there.
Yep.
The other thing I think is fascinating about this park, and there are some like this, but I think that it kind of goes against the grain on what you think of when you think of a park. A lot of people think of a big grand entrance. The one that pops to mind for me is like at Yellowstone, you have the Roosevelt Arch. At Cedar Creek and Belle Grove, you're really incorporated into the community that's there and maybe some fuzzy boundaries. In fact, when I went to visit, even the main park headquarters is an old house that, somebody used to live in. And that's new and unique. And I'd love to hear about how maybe people navigate coming to a park that is kind of spread out throughout this community.
Yeah, so this park, it does kind of feel a little different when you come here. The park is, like you said, is kind of insinuated into the community in Middletown and kind of spread out around it as well. So, for example, our visitor center is in a strip mall in downtown Middletown. So a lot of people don't expect that. But as with a lot of parks, that's a great place to start. We have exhibits there, and you can pick up your self guides for the tour or download the National Park Service app, pick up the Junior Ranger booklet, and start your visit after seeing some of the exhibits there, including we have a three-dimensional animated battlefield map that's lit up with fiber optic lights that narrates the events of the battle and kind of shows the terrain of the battlefield. Um, After that, though, it's not always clear. Maybe when you're in the park and outside the park, there are a lot of features of the battlefield that are right there in Middletown or in kind of around the park, but not necessarily in the boundary. I would say a lot of that stuff isn't that important. The important things to see and do would be you start at the visitor center. And then we've got a couple other partners who have properties that you should visit. And they include the Cedar Creek Battlefield Foundation, which has a museum right on Route 11, overlooking some of the preserved parts of the battlefield at Belle Grove, and they have a museum exhibit there about the preservation of the battlefield. And then there's Belle Grove Plantation, which was kind of at the heart of the battlefield, but their main focus is interpreting the plantation property that house stands on. It's a pretty old manor house that dates back to 1797, and a grandson of one of the original settlers, white settlers of the valley. And you can take a tour of the manor house there. You can also take an auto tour, a driving tour of the battlefield, and it'll take you past a lot of those places, and also down into some lesser kind of seen parts of the park where some of the battles took place. And a lot of those auto tour stops, there are trails that you can pick up and walk on. And so you can spend a good half a day to a full day just exploring the battlefield at Cedar Creek.
Yeah,
And
I
visiting. Yeah.
yeah, I could have spent I mean, I probably spent, a half a day, 3/4 of a day, and I could have definitely soaked up a little bit more time exploring and reading and seeing the sights. One of the things you talked about are the trails and the hiking. These aren't long trails. They're completely manageable, nice parking areas, and then a beautiful walk. The one of them I did, the 19th Corps trenches, was through the woods. The morning attacks trail was through a field. So I want to talk a little bit about both of those. The 19th Corps trenches, there's a small parking lot, and then you kind of walk up. I don't know, maybe a service road is that's what I would call, or a
Yeah, it was an old construction road.
yeah, and there's markers. The one thing that I can't figure out is what is the difference between the white, red, and blue arrow markers on this trail?
There's a few different legs to the trails around the trenches, and they're just marked red, white, and blue.
Okay.
Um,
Um,
so yeah,
Much more simple than I was coming up with in my head. But it is fascinating because you'll walk off and you do guys do an amazing job of having like a bench and a plaque where you can read about it. Identifying trenches, I don't know what it is challenging for me. And maybe it's because it was a fall and everything is like covered in leaves, so everything looks exactly the same. But what does somebody look for when they're out in a battlefield to see trenches?
well, they're hard for us to identify too. The trenches that are left over from the Civil War are, 150 years old or more, and they're pretty seriously weathered. And in the case of that trail, overgrown by woodland. So they are hard to see. You do have to know a little bit about what you're looking for, but once you figure it out, they're not too hard to see. Starting in the fall, when the vegetation starts to come down a little bit, they are very, very shallow depressions, kind of a snaky line along the trails. And there should be a little bit of a kind of a ridge, a mound, or like a parapet on one side of the trenches, but they're pretty worn down from their original size and depth. They may have been like 3 or 4 feet deep at one time, but now they're kind of hard to see. You have to look kind of see where the leaves collect among
Especially
the
in a part of the world, in the part of the region where it's kind of rolling anyway.
yeah. It's
It can be deceiving. But I think that I was so appreciative of having gone through everything in the visitor center to hear the stories and then to read the plaques. They made a little bit more sense to me because I had done a little bit of prep work. But it's really fascinating how you'll identify the trenches, but then kind of tell the story of what happened at that point on that day and who were the big key players in it, which I think was really fascinating to me. And so that trail, I don't know, it's probably a mile, mile and a half, would you say?
It, you can, yeah, well, if you take every little kind of spur and leg, yeah, it's a mile and a half, maybe. And you can take it all the way to Belle Grove now. It kind of connects all the way through that woodland, kind of hooks around to the,
Oh, that would be much longer.
yeah.
Yeah, I definitely didn't do that. But then you go back and at the park, if you park in a parking lot that's right by the park headquarters, and I bring that up because it's kind of the identifying marker, this house on Route 11, then you can go to the morning attacks trail. And I think it was more what I anticipated in a Civil War battlefield, but it's an open field and you all have these great paths through it. But maybe tell us a little bit about the importance of what happened at the morning attacks trail.
Yeah, so if you visit the morning attack trail and you park in the lot near the park headquarters, which is just a mid-century house that we took over that was built on the battlefield, you go down into a little ravine, and then you're kind of following the route of some of the federal soldiers who were responding to the Confederate surprise attack in the morning of October 19th. And so those soldiers had to go into that ravine and then up the bank into the field you were talking about, where they attempted to hold off the Confederate attack on the Eighth Corps camp. So the fields you're looking at are some of the fields where the Eighth Corps was camped, the U.S. Eighth Corps was camped and under attack in the pre-dawn hours of October 19th. And there was a lot of confusion. They were caught by surprise, and the federal troops were retreating, but some came from across the pike, including the 8th Vermont, which engaged in some pretty intense hand-to-hand fighting. And along that trail, you'll see a monument to the 8th Vermont, who fought to hold off the Confederate attackers just long enough so that some of the rest of the troops could retreat back across the turnpike and catch up with the rest of the army. But those Vermont soldiers took some pretty heavy casualties, kind of fending off the Confederates. If you walk around the trails, you're in kind of more like an open field. It kind of looks like a battlefield there. As you mentioned, you can kind of, if you pay attention to some of the kind of gentle changes in the terrain, you can kind of see where it would have been hard to see somebody sneaking up on you, kind of concealed by a little rise in the terrain, and coming through the early morning fog and the rising sun in the east would have made it hard for the U.S. soldiers to see the Confederates attacking until they were right on top of them.
Absolutely. And in that area, you come across, so you come up the hill and there's the monument and there's some benches there. Is that where ranger programs are typically held, or what's the significance of those benches?
But yeah, places to sit and contemplate. Sometimes we
Okay.
do ranger talks there. Yeah.
Oh, I love it. Sit and contemplate. It would be a beautiful spot for that, for sure.
Yeah, the
Um,
location is very pretty.
It's really stunning. So you and I both mentioned this driving tour, and I know there's 9 stops on it, and we have actually already talked about some of the things you see on the stops. Any other highlights from those stops that we should let people know about and get them excited?
If you like battlefield monuments, we don't have a lot, but we have a few neat ones. The 8th Vermont Monument, these are not Gettysburg scale monuments. They're usually pretty small. The Vermont Monument is just a slab of marble with an inscription. The 128th New York Monument is at the kind of the end of that trench line we were talking about. So it's right at the beginning of the 19th Corps Trail. Some of the other stops include the cemetery in Middletown, where the Federals regrouped and tried to halt the Confederate advance. Eventually, they were fired on by cannon set up by the Confederates on the other side of Valley Turnpike and had to retreat. And another key point to visit is the approximate, I guess, 2 places to visit would be the approximate lines where the Confederates kind of stopped advancing, which was kind of along one of the roads that still exists today, and another road where the Federals kind of reformed their line in the afternoon counterattack. And following that, the Federals drove the Confederates back out of Middletown. So all those points are stops along the tour.
And one of the things that I like, I think it's maybe 2 of them are right along the roadway. And so I think that people need to be really careful if they're going to stop and look at these spots.
Yeah, pretty much all the stops are right along a road. There are a couple places where you can pull off and park in a lot, but a couple of them are really just kind of wide places in the road. And yes, do be careful. Route 11 is a major kind of through road. People drive through there pretty quickly once they're out of Middletown. So yeah, use caution pulling over on the side of the
Yeah.
road.
But they're
Make sure you
beautiful.
plenty of room. Yeah, it's
Yeah.
pretty scenery along the route.
It is. It is. And I know on the website you guys talk about that and remind people that you just be careful when you're pulling over to see some of these things,
Yep.
which is important. I brought up ranger programs, but I know you guys have several of them. Is there a particular time of year where you're running them, not running them, and what sorts of topics do you tend to cover?
Summer kind of leading up the anniversary of the battle, which is October 19th. In addition to being able to take a self-guided tour of the battlefield, either using our self-guide publication or the National Park Service app, rangers do lead tours of the battlefield. And we don't always stop at all the stops, but we usually cover much of it. If all the stops take a while for it with a ranger, but you can spend 2 hours kind of visiting as many as 5 or 6 of the 9 stops. And
I would think that would be pretty
see
impressive
most of the
storytelling.
battlefield. Yeah, we've had some pretty talented rangers over the years.
Yeah.
And we also give talks over at Belle Grove pretty regularly, usually just introductions to the park, but sometimes we talk about more specific aspects of history, including some of the history that you'll hear about from Belle Grove.
And then I think a lot of people that I talk to when they want to explore a park, they think about the kind of the camping and lodging. This isn't a park that has campgrounds.
Correct.
Though you're in a region where there's lots of camping that you could do and easily get to the
Also
park.
correct. Yeah, so the park doesn't have any camping there, and there's no private campgrounds in Middletown at the moment. We're right along I-81, so there's plenty of places to stay along the interstate exits. Yeah, plenty of places to stay, plenty of places to eat. Within 15 minutes
Yeah.
driving.
And plug the wonderful smaller towns there, Middletown and Stephen City and Winchester, and they all have really great places with unique stops that you can see. And I think the other thing is this is one beautiful park in an area that has a lot of beautiful parks and the nation's capital fairly close by, so it's really easy to see a lot of things when you're visiting this part of the country.
Yeah, very true. Harper's Ferry National
Oh,
Historical
yeah.
Park isn't too far. Sino Canal, Shenandoah National Park would be the closest, and on the other side, the Blue Ridge, Manassas isn't too far away, and DC is about 80 miles.
Yeah, so if you can get a lot of Civil War history in a very short visit and soak up some beautiful scenery at the parks. What else do you think we need to tell people about Cedar Creek and Belle Grove?
I think that it's maybe not as well known a battlefield as a place like Gettysburg or Manassas, which are nearby, but was a pretty important battle. And the preservation here, kind of unlike Gettysburg, which was almost automatically kind of memorialized. This place has only relatively recently come under preservation. And so the park is at once not entirely what you might expect is like kind of a self-contained battlefield park, but like you said, it's kind of insinuated into the town. Middletown has a historic district, nearby Strasburg has a historic district that are kind of affiliated with the events of the battle. And I think you kind of think a little beyond the park boundaries and are willing to do some exploring on your own. I think you can find a lot of neat things around here.
Adam, to close out each episode, I do a speed round of questions. So
Sure.
I'll give you a few of these and just answer with what first comes to mind. What is your earliest park memory?
So the sunken forest at Fire Island.
What made you love the parks?
Being a ranger made me love them.
What is your favorite thing about Cedar Creek and Belle Grove National Historical Park?
Probably the fall scenery.
What is your favorite thing to do at Cedar Creek and Belle Grove National Historical Park?
I walk up to the 8th Vermont Monument. It's a nice short walk, a little bit of a hill, nice and fairly quiet for being in between two major highways.
What park have you yet to visit but is on your bucket list and why?
Yellowstone, and I probably don't need to tell you why.
What are 3 must-haves you pack for a park visit?
Water, good walking shoes, and a hat. I think that covers just about every park.
What is your favorite campfire activity?
It's just being quiet.
Tent, camper, or cabin?
Hmm.
Hiking with or without trekking poles?
Depends. I prefer without. Sometimes I need them.
What is your favorite trail snack?
Anything that doesn't have a lot of crumbs, like a soft granola bar.
What is your favorite animal sighting?
That's a hard one. I always get a kick out of seals and marine animals like dolphins and porpoises and whales.
What is your favorite sound in the park?
Natural silence.
What is the greatest gift that the parks give to us?
They we get out of them what we put into it. Just an opportunity to maybe, you know, see something that hasn't changed in a long time or has been maintained for its beauty and for its specialness for everyone to enjoy.
Adam, thank you so much for being part of the Parks podcast. It is Thanksgiving week, so happy Thanksgiving to you and your family. And we really appreciate you being here.
Thank you, Missy. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to today's episode. Until next time, we'll see you in the parks. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, please be sure to like and share on your favorite podcast platform. Music for the Parks podcast is written, performed, and produced by Porter Hardy. For more information, please follow us on Instagram at The Parks Podcast or visit our website at theparkspodcast.com.